Theme parks are designed to feel invincible, controlled thrills, rehearsed fear. But when systems slip, the illusion tears and the footage outlives the fun. We're descending an iceberg of real incidents, each deeper layer more unsettling than the last. Not for shock, but to see the pattern. Small misses that became irreversible moments. By the bottom, one question remains. How did anyone think this was safe? Our first story takes us to Lightwater Valley in the UK back in 2014. The park's crown jewel was the Ultimate, Europe's longest roller coaster, a sprawling steel giant that roared through the countryside at nearly 50 miles per hour. On a summer Saturday, riders strapped in expecting thrills, not horror. As the train raced around a bend, it struck something on the tracks. In an instant, screams erupted. A deer had wandered onto the course, and the train plowed through without stopping. Passengers in the front cars were suddenly hit with what they quickly realized were the remains of the animal. Some thought at first it was part of the ride, until the shock set in. Panic rippled through the cars as the reality became clear. They had collided with a living creature at full speed. The ride completed its circuit and returned to the station, its cars still marked by the impact. Riders staggered out, traumatized. Witnesses described the scene as unimaginable. Staff rushed to close the attraction, cleaning the ride and resetting it down the track and train for half an hour before reopening. But no cleaning could erase the memory of what had happened. The park later confirmed the story, explaining that wild animals occasionally breach the perimeter fence at night. It was meant to sound reassuring, but for those on board, the words were hollow. The Ultimate was designed to deliver adrenaline and excitement. That day, it delivered something else entirely, a nightmare no rider could forget. Next, we travel to Spain in 2005 to the Warner Brothers Park in Madrid. This story is about an attraction called the Haunted Hotel, a ride designed to create illusions and scares. It ends in a large room where guests sit on a long bench that moves, creating a feeling of intense vertigo and disorientation. For a 23-year-old man named Francisco Javier Infante, this illusion became a deadly reality. He was visiting the park with his sister, his girlfriend, and other family members. They all boarded the Haunted Hotel ride, and as the final sequence began, something went terribly wrong. According to the park's initial story, Francisco suffered a panic attack, managed to get out from under the safety bar, and stood up while the ride was moving. He was then struck in the head by a piece of the ride's machinery. But his family, especially his sister Sarah, who was on the ride with him, told a completely different and more disturbing story. She claimed the safety bar was faulty, and that her brother lifted it with no effort. He got dizzy and stood up, likely thinking he was safe against a wall, not realizing the entire room was in motion. Dizzy and disoriented, he stumbled onto a ledge, but the ride was still in motion. The machinery struck him once, then again, and again. She described the horror of watching it happen, with passengers screaming for the ride to stop, but it kept going until its cycle was complete. The park officials claimed they monitored the ride with security cameras, which led the family to ask the most chilling question. If someone was watching the camera, why didn't they stop the ride? Why did no one do anything while he was being fatally injured? The investigation later revealed the truth was closer to the family's account. A court ruled the death was the park's fault, finding both the maintenance manager and the security camera supervisor negligent. Francisco didn't die because of a mistake he made. He died because the very system built to protect him failed in the most brutal way. Staying in Spain, our next case is from 2010 at the Tibidabo amusement park in Barcelona. The ride was called El Pendulo, or the Pendulum. It was a giant arm that swung riders over 100 feet into the air before dropping them at speeds of over 60 miles per hour. It was a major thrill ride, popular with teenagers looking for an adrenaline rush. On a busy Saturday evening with thousands of people in the park, 4 teenagers, all around 14 and 15 years old, were on the pendulum. As the ride reached the peak of its swing, a catastrophic failure occurred. The entire anchorage system at the base of the ride broke apart. The massive screws holding the giant arm to its concrete foundation snapped. The whole structure, weighing tons, came crashing to the ground. It fell onto another ride nearby, which luckily was empty at the time. The 4 teenagers on the pendulum were trapped underneath the wreckage. News footage from that night shows the twisted metal of the fallen ride, a scene of absolute devastation. Firefighters and emergency crews worked desperately to rescue the teens. Tragically, a 15-year-old girl died at the scene. The other 3 were injured, one of them critically. She had to be airlifted to a hospital and underwent surgery for multiple broken bones. The investigation focused on how this could have possibly happened. The ride had just been inspected a month prior and was given a clean bill of health. Engineers who examined the wreckage discovered that the screws at the base had simply failed under the immense stress. It was a horrifying mechanical breakdown that nobody saw coming. For over 100 years, Tibidabo Park had never had a fatal accident. That perfect record was shattered in a few terrifying seconds, leaving a family devastated and a city in shock, all because of a few broken screws. For our last story in this tier, we head to the United States, specifically to a county fair in Greenville, Tennessee, in 2016. Ferris wheels are supposed to be the most classic, gentle ride at any fair. They offer nice views and a moment of calm. But for 3 young girls, this classic ride turned into an absolute nightmare. The girls, ages 6, 10, and 16, were riding together in one of the baskets. As the wheel turned, their basket suddenly tipped over, dumping all 3 of them out. They fell between 35 and 40 feet to the ground below. The chaos was captured by people on the ground. Photos and cell phone videos immediately spread across social media, showing the horrifying image of the Ferris wheel basket hanging nearly upside down. You can see the moment of panic as people realized what had happened. All 3 girls were rushed to the hospital with serious injuries. The youngest, the 6-year-old, suffered a traumatic brain injury. The 16-year-old was in critical condition, and the 10-year-old had a broken arm. An investigation was launched immediately, and inspectors found the cause was a mechanical failure. They didn't release specifics right away, but it was clear something on the ride itself had broken, causing the basket to flip. The ride was operated by a company called Family Attractions Amusements, which had other rides at the fair. The footage and photos from that day serve as a chilling reminder that even the simplest of rides can fail, and the consequences can be devastating. Our next case takes us back to Spain, to the Terra Mítica Park in Benidorm in 2014. An 18-year-old tourist from Iceland was visiting the park with his family, looking for a day of fun. He decided to ride the Inferno, a twisting, spinning roller coaster that subjects riders to intense G-forces. The ride has small cars, and riders are secured by an over-the-shoulder harness. As the ride whipped through its course, the teenager's harness allegedly failed. It opened mid-ride, and he was thrown from his seat. He fell a great distance, hitting the ground below. Park staff and paramedics rushed to help him, but his injuries were too severe. He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. A British tourist who witnessed the aftermath told reporters that her own daughter had been on that same ride, possibly in the very same seat, just 5 minutes earlier. She described the scene of people shouting and pointing, and the obvious devastation of the boy's family. The key question was how a harness could simply open. The park management insisted the ride was certified as safe and checked daily by their staff. The investigation focused on that harness. Was it a hidden mechanical flaw, or was it not properly secured before the ride started? The name of the ride, Inferno, which is Catalan for hell, became a dark and tragic piece of irony. For that family, a holiday vacation turned into the worst possible nightmare, all because a safety device, the one thing that was supposed to protect him, failed at the worst possible moment. Next, we travel to Darien Lake theme park in New York in 2011 for one of the most heartbreaking stories on this list. It involves a 29-year-old U.S. Army veteran named James Hackemer. James was a true hero who had lost both of his legs in a roadside bomb attack while serving in Iraq in 2008. After years of recovery, he was at the park with his family, trying to find moments of joy and normalcy. He decided to ride the Ride of Steel, a massive hypercoaster that stands over 200 feet tall. Because of his injuries, he didn't have legs, which are crucial for the ride's T-bar lap restraint to work properly. A regular rider's legs would be held down by the bar, but for James, there was nothing to hold him in place. He was helped onto the ride and placed in the front seat. As the coaster went over a hill, he was lifted out of his seat and ejected from the ride, falling to his death. The investigation that followed placed the blame squarely on operator error. The ride attendants should have known that a person without legs could not be safely secured by that restraint system. A final report stated that employees were negligent for allowing him to ride. The park updated its safety signage and retrained its staff, but it was too late for James. His family said that in those moments on the ride, he was just happy, and that it was the most normal he had felt since his injury. That tragic quote makes the story even more painful. He was a hero who survived a war, only to die on a roller coaster because the people in charge failed to protect him. This next story, from 2013, happened at Six Flags Over Texas on the famous Texas Giant roller coaster. This ride is a hybrid coaster, known for its steep drops and sharp banked turns. A 52-year-old woman named Rosa Esparza was at the park with her family. She boarded the Texas Giant and sat down in one of the cars. As a ride attendant came by to check her safety restraint, a simple T-bar that comes down over the lap, she expressed concern that it wasn't secure enough. A witness waiting in line, Carmen Brown, overheard the entire exchange. She said the attendant was nonchalant, telling Rosa that as long as she heard it click, she was fine. According to the witness, Rosa's restraint only seemed to click once, and she still felt unsafe, but the ride was dispatched. As the train went down the ride's first major drop and into a sharp turn, Rosa was thrown from her seat, falling 75 feet to her death onto the roof of a tunnel below. The horror for the other passengers, including her own family on the ride with him, is unimaginable. When the train returned to the station, witnesses described her empty seat and the panic of her family members screaming for someone to let them off to find her. The park's investigation concluded it was not a mechanical failure, which led to intense scrutiny of the ride's design. The ride was closed for months and reopened with redesigned restraint, bars, new pads, and seatbelts on every seat as an added precaution. The incident led to Six Flags adding seatbelts to many of their other coasters across the country as a direct result. It was a horrifying, preventable tragedy that began with a passenger's desperate concern that was tragically ignored. In 2007, at Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom, a 13-year-old girl named Caitlin Lassiter went to the park with her friends. They decided to ride the Superman Tower of Power, which was a drop tower ride. It lifts riders 177 feet into the air and then drops them in a high-speed freefall. Caitlin and her friends had already ridden it once and got back in line for a second time. As their car began to ascend the tower, they heard a strange whipping sound and felt the ride jolt. They looked up and saw that a cable had snapped and was falling down on top of them. The thick steel cable wrapped around Caitlin's body and neck. The operator didn't hit the emergency stop button right away, and in those crucial seconds of delay, the ride continued its climb. Just as the operator finally stopped the ascent, the ride's programming kicked in for the freefall. As the car dropped at 54 miles per hour, the broken cable that was wrapped around Caitlin's legs pulled tight. The tension caused devastating injuries to her legs. She was left sitting in the ride's seat in critical condition as the ride came to a stop. Because of the safety mechanisms, she was trapped in her seat for what must have felt like an eternity before rescuers could get to her. Surgeons managed to save part of what was lost, but she would live with permanent injuries. The investigation revealed gross negligence. Instead of following the manufacturer's maintenance manual, park technicians had been applying cornstarch to the cables to prevent them from slipping. It was a completely avoidable tragedy caused by a horrifying series of failures. Disneyland is supposed to be the happiest place on Earth, but on September 5th, 2003, that image was shattered. The Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, a favorite for families, became the scene of a tragedy. On that day, a 22-year-old man named Marcelo Torres was on the ride when things went horribly wrong. As the train careened through one of the tunnels, a loud bang echoed, and the lead locomotive derailed. The first passenger car, where Marcelo was sitting, slammed into the underside of the engine. He suffered massive internal injuries and died at the scene. 10 other riders were injured in the chaos. The accident was a huge shock. This wasn't some rickety carnival ride. This was Disneyland, a place with a reputation for safety. Investigators swarmed the park, and the ride was shut down for months. What they found was chilling. The cause wasn't some freak accident. It was human error. A maintenance procedure had been done incorrectly. Fasteners on a wheel assembly on the locomotive hadn't been properly tightened or secured. As the train went into the tunnel, that axle came loose, jammed up the works, and caused the locomotive to literally jump off the tracks, hit the ceiling of the tunnel, and then fall back down onto the car behind it. The park's president and even the CEO of Disney, Michael Eisner, came to the scene to address the media, but the damage was done. The ride eventually reopened in March 2004, but for many, the memory of what happened in that tunnel still lingers. Imagine the excitement of a brand new amusement park opening in your city. That was the scene in Karachi, Pakistan, in the summer of 2018. Askari amusement park had just opened, and on the night of July 15th, it was filled with families. One of the main attractions was a giant pendulum ride called Discovery. It swung riders high into the air, spinning them around. But that night, the ride was still in its trial phase. As it swung upwards, reaching about 40 feet in the air, a loud crack echoed through the park. The main arm of the ride snapped, and the gondola, packed with people, came crashing down to the ground. The whole horrifying moment was captured on cell phone videos by people in the park. The footage is chaotic and shaky. You can see the ride collapse, followed by screams and people running in every direction. When the dust settled, the scene was horrific. A 12-year-old girl named Kashaf Dukhtar was killed instantly. More than 20 other people were seriously injured. What came out in the investigation was even more disturbing. The park's manager admitted that the rides had all been imported from China, and that no government officials had ever come to inspect them for safety. There were basically no laws or regulations in place to make sure these massive machines were safe for the public. The park's management reportedly disappeared from the scene right after the accident. In response to the tragedy, the government ordered that all amusement parks in the province be shut down until they could be inspected. But for the family of young Kashaf, it was far too late. The videos of the collapse serve as a chilling record of a disaster that never should have happened. The West Edmonton Mall in Canada is home to Galaxyland, an indoor amusement park. Its star attraction for years was the Mindbender, the world's largest indoor triple-loop roller coaster. On the evening of June 14, 1986, the park was full of people enjoying a concert below the massive coaster. A train full of riders clicked its way up the lift hill. One of the passengers was a 25-year-old named Rod Shaiko, who was there with his best friend David. The ride started normally, but as the train headed towards the final loop, something went terribly wrong. The last car of the train began to fishtail violently. Inside, Rod grabbed onto his lap bar for dear life. An investigation later found that 4 critical bolts on the wheel assembly had failed. The car was literally coming apart from the track. As it swayed back and forth, the lap bars unlocked. The car went into the final loop, but didn't have enough speed to make it over. It stalled at the top and began to slide backward. As it rolled back down, the derailed car slammed into a concrete support pillar, stopping the train instantly. 3 people, including Rod's best friend David, were killed. Rod himself was thrown from the car and landed on the concrete floor below, behind a barrier. He survived, but his injuries were catastrophic. He had 2 broken legs, a broken pelvis, a punctured lung, and a broken shoulder. He spent 6 months in the hospital and had to learn to walk again. The investigation revealed major flaws in the ride's design and maintenance routines. The Mindbender was closed for months. When it reopened, the trains had been completely redesigned. They were shortened from 4 cars to 3, and new safety features like seatbelts and shoulder restraints were added to the lap bars. The ride has run without another major incident since, but for the survivors and the families of those who died, the memory of that night is a wound that never fully heals. Social media has changed the way we see the world, and sometimes that means we see tragedies happen almost in real time. This was the case on a Saturday in September 2019 at the La Feria amusement park in Mexico City. The park was home to a huge, iconic roller coaster called Quimera. You could see it from the highway, a massive structure with 3 bright yellow and red vertical loops. The ride had been at other parks around the world before it ended up in Mexico City. On this particular day, it was running as usual, packed with thrill seekers. A video, filmed by someone in the park, captured the moment of disaster. In the footage, which you can find online, you see the Quimera train speeding along the track. As it goes through one of the metal loops, you see the last car break away from the train and drop from the structure from a height of about 33 feet, crashing onto the ground below. 2 men, one aged 18 and the other 21, were killed. They died from head injuries and other trauma. 2 women were also injured in the crash. A preliminary investigation pointed to a mechanical failure as the cause. Something had caused the car to come loose from the rest of the train. The authorities immediately began investigating the accident as a case of negligent homicide, meaning they believed someone was criminally responsible for what happened. A vendor who worked at the park told a local news outlet that she saw some riders being violently displaced as the car failed. She said the other riders sustained severe trauma as the train dragged the failing car as the coaster continued to speed along, dragging the broken, flailing car behind it for a moment before it fell. The La Feria Park was shut down immediately after the accident. It's one thing to hear about an accident, but it's another thing entirely to see it happen, to see that car flip and fall, and to know that people lost their lives in that exact instant. Sometimes the most horrifying accidents aren't caused by a mechanical failure, but by a simple, tragic human error. This next story took place at a Six Flags Over Georgia in June of 2008. The ride involved was Batman, the Ride, a popular roller coaster where riders sit in seats that hang from the track above, with their feet dangling in the air. On that Saturday, a 17-year-old boy named Asia LeSean Ferguson was visiting the park with a group from his church. At some point, he had been on the Batman coaster and had lost his hat. Later that day, he decided he wanted to get it back. To do that, he hopped over a 6-foot fence into a restricted area right underneath the roller coaster. This area was clearly marked with signs that said "Do not enter" and "Authorized personnel only." It was a dangerous off-limits area for a reason. But Asia scaled a second 6-foot fence, putting himself directly in the path of the ride. A friend who was with him also entered the restricted area, but thankfully he was not injured. According to police, the Batman roller coaster was operating at full speed when it came through that section of the track. The ride's top speed is 50 miles per hour. As the train full of riders flew by, it fatally struck Asia. An off-duty police officer who was at the park witnessed the accident and called for help. But there was nothing anyone could do. No one on the ride itself was injured, and it's possible they didn't even know what had happened until the ride was over. Six Flags closed the ride for the rest of the day out of respect for the boy's family, who were also at the park with him. His father later described him as a happy-go-lucky young man who was always smiling. He was just a teenager who made a terrible mistake. The fences and the signs are there for a reason. They are there to protect you from the massive, powerful machinery that makes these parks run. Ignoring them, even for a second, can have the most devastating consequences imaginable. Haunted house attractions are supposed to be scary, but it's a safe kind of scary. You know the monsters aren't real, the dangers are all part of the show. You get to experience the thrill of being scared without any actual risk. But in October of 2017, at Ocean Park in Hong Kong, the horror became terrifyingly real for one young man. The park was running its annual Halloween Fest, and one of the new attractions was called Buried Alive. The concept was pretty intense. The website promised visitors the experience of being buried alive alone, before fighting their way out of their dark and eerie grave. Visitors would get inside a coffin, which would then act as a slide, sending them down into the haunted house part of the attraction for a single-player experience. On a day for a special preview event before the festival officially opened, a 21-year-old man, identified by his surname Chung, entered the Buried Alive ride. He went down the coffin slide and into the haunted house maze, but somewhere inside he made a wrong turn. According to park officials, he wandered into a restricted backstage area. This was a place where staff conducted maintenance, a place that visitors were never supposed to see. What happened next is not entirely clear, but police believe he was hit by moving parts of the ride's mechanics. Local media reported that he was struck by the coffin slide mechanism itself. 5 minutes after he had entered the attraction, staff found him unconscious. First aid was performed and an ambulance was called, but it was too late. He was confirmed dead at the hospital. This was the first fatal accident at the park's Halloween event since it started in 2001. The Buried Alive attraction was immediately closed down, and the Electrical and Mechanical Services Department launched a full investigation. A structural engineer commented that such an area should have been locked to prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening, and that a haunted house should be designed with only one way out to avoid confusion. It was a complete breakdown of safety protocol. A young man went in to experience being buried alive, and in a tragic twist of fate, he lost his life inside that very attraction. On July 4th, 2020, a 32-year-old woman named Elodie Duval went to Parc Saint-Paul in northern France. She was there with her partner, Michael, her sister, and her son, Alan, to celebrate Alan's second birthday. It was supposed to be a happy family day out. Later that day, Elodie and Michael decided to ride the Formula One, a steel roller coaster known as a Wild Mouse. These rides are famous for their compact layout, and sharp, unbanked turns that make you feel like you're going to fly off the track. This particular ride, however, had a troubled history. In 2009, a 35-year-old woman was thrown from the ride and died. At the time, the park's management claimed the woman had acted inappropriately on the ride, causing her to fall. But after that incident, they did add seatbelts to the cars, which had previously only had a single lap bar. For 11 years, there were no more serious incidents. But then, in 2019, the year before Elodie's visit, the park manager, Jalis Campion, ordered the seatbelts to be removed from the Formula One ride, claiming they weren't a real element of safety. He also had the ride's lap bar mechanism altered. The first locking notch on each safety bar was ground down, apparently to prevent larger people from being able to ride. Crucially, these modifications were done after the ride's annual safety inspection, and the changes were never disclosed to the safety authorities, which is against the law. On the day of her visit, Elodie and Michael queued up and got into one of the coaster's cars. Elodie was a larger woman. The lap bar was put down, the operators gave the okay, and the ride set off. The incident happened near the very end of the ride. The park manager would later describe it himself, saying that towards the end there are 2 bumps in the track. He said that's when Elodie found herself propelled out of her seat. In front of her horrified partner, Elodie was ejected from the ride. Michael tried desperately to save her. As she was slipping over the safety bar, he managed to grab her leg and held on, but he couldn't keep his grip. She slipped from his arms and fell. The ride operator hit the emergency stop. But the way the brake system worked, the cars continue until they hit the next brake section. She fell to the ground at the very last brake. Her family watched in horror as emergency services rushed to help her, but it was no use. They tried to resuscitate her for an hour, but she died from a cardiac arrest brought on by the fall. The investigation that followed revealed the illegal and unapproved modifications. The park manager was charged with involuntary homicide. Investigators concluded that if the safety bar hadn't been ground down, Elodie, a woman who was full of life and who adored her son, would still be alive. The Formula One ride was completely dismantled and never reopened. Orlando Freefall at Icon Park was brand new and held the record for the world's tallest drop tower. On the night of March 24, 2022, a 14-year-old boy, who was a larger rider, was directed to a specific seat, number 1, because it was known to have a bit more room. The ride operators load everyone, and then they do a visual check of the seats. They're looking for a safety light to be on for each rider, which it was. The ride starts its slow, massive climb up 430 feet. As it goes up, one of the operators jokes over the intercom about making sure seatbelts are buckled, but this ride didn't even have seatbelts, just an over-the-shoulder restraint. At the very top, the seats tilt forward 30 degrees, so everyone is facing the ground. Then it drops. As the ride vehicle rockets towards the bottom and the powerful magnetic brakes engage, the boy in seat 1 comes out of the restraint during the drop and does not survive the fall. The investigation brought in a company called Quest Engineering, and their report is where the story gets really disturbing. They found no mechanical failure, nothing on the ride broke. Instead, they focused on seat 1. They measured the gap between the seat horn, which comes up between your legs, and the bottom of the pulled-down restraint. On most of the seats, the maximum opening was about 3.3 inches, but on seat 1, it was a massive 7.19 inches. Seat 2 was also way bigger than the rest at 6.51 inches. The reason for this was chilling. The safety system used a magnetic sensor to tell if the harness was locked in a safe position. Investigators found wear marks, showing that the sensors for seats 1 and 2 had been manually adjusted after the ride was installed. Someone had moved them, which tricked the ride's computer into thinking the restraints were safely closed when they were actually wide open. This adjustment allowed for that 7-inch gap. With the original factory setting, the gap would have been closer to 3 inches. The report also found that when force was applied, like the 4 Gs of braking force at the bottom of the drop, the restraint opening could grow by another 3 inches, so that 7-inch gap likely became a 10-inch gap. Safety experts later concluded survival was impossible under those conditions. The investigation also slammed the ride's operators, who were trained internally by the owner, the Slingshot Group. They were never given a training manual. The manufacturer's manual clearly stated operators should physically pull on each harness, which didn't happen. It also said riders who looked too large shouldn't be allowed to ride. The video clearly shows the boy's harness was visibly much higher than everyone else's. The person who actually adjusted those sensors has never been publicly named, though the owner claims to know who it was. In the end, no criminal charges were filed. The owner paid a $250,000 fine, and the ride was dismantled in March 2023, just a year after the accident. Now let's go back in time to a place that was legendary for how dangerous it was, Action Park in New Jersey. Running from the late 70s to the mid-90s, this place was less of a theme park and more of a social experiment. Its whole philosophy, driven by its owner Eugene Mulvihill, was putting you in control of the action. This meant you were also in control of your own safety, and people were not ready for that. They nicknamed it Traction Park and Accident Park for good reason. Let's start with the Alpine Slide. You'd sit on a tiny plastic sled with a handbrake that barely worked and fly down a concrete and asbestos track. People would get thrown off all the time, shredding their skin on the concrete. Employees said the track often showed signs of repeated accidents on it by the end of a busy day. Then there was Motor World. They had these go-karts and Formula One style races that you could get going up to 50 miles per hour. And of course, there were beer stands right next to the track. Drunk people, sometimes underage, driving incredibly fast karts with almost no safety features. But the most infamous area was Waterworld. This is where the most serious injuries and deaths happened. They had a ride called the Cannonball Loop, which was a fully enclosed water slide with a complete vertical loop at the end. It's a design you just don't see anymore because it's almost impossible to make safe. They tested it with dummies, and one reportedly came back without a head. To get people to try it, they offered employees $100. People would get stuck at the top of the loop or come out with bloody noses and back injuries. It was only open for a month before the state shut it down. When they went inside to see why people were getting cut up, they discovered debris from earlier accidents lodged inside the ride. But the deadliest attraction of all was the tidal wave pool, which employees called the grave pool. It was massive, and the waves it generated were huge and powerful. Because it got deep so quickly and the water was freezing, people who couldn't swim well would get pulled in over their heads and panic. The sheer number of people in the pool made it impossible for lifeguards to see everyone. On a busy weekend, they'd rescue up to 30 people. 3 different people drowned in that pool on 3 separate occasions, and those weren't the only deaths. A man died on the Alpine Slide after his cart flew off the track and he hit his head on a rock. Another man was electrocuted in the kayak experience when he stepped out of his boat and touched a live underwater fan. Another died of a heart attack, supposedly from the shock of the freezing cold water under the Tarzan swing. The park got away with it for so long because the rides were so unique that regulators didn't know how to classify them. The owner also fought every single lawsuit viciously because it turned out he had no real insurance. He created a fake shell company to insure the park. Eventually, the mountain of lawsuits bankrupted the company, and the original Action Park closed in 1996. It was a place that could never exist today, a true relic of a time when safety was just a suggestion. Next up is a case that's just bizarre and tragic, known as Black Sunday at Kings Island in Ohio. This all happened on June 9th, 1991. It was a single evening, but it involved 2 completely separate and fatal incidents just over an hour apart. The first incident happened around 8:30 p.m. near a man-made lake. A 22-year-old man named Timothy Binning was with his friend, 21-year-old William Heathcote. As they were crossing a walkway, Binning reached over to splash some water and was immediately electrocuted, falling into the lake. Seeing his friend in distress, Heathcote did what any friend would do. He jumped in to save him. A 20-year-old park security guard named Darrell Robertson also saw what was happening and heroically jumped in to help as well. Tragically, both Heathcote and Robertson were also electrocuted and died in the water. The only survivor was Binning, the first man who fell in. He was hospitalized with burns, but he lived. The investigation that followed found the cause was an underwater aerator pump that was meant to keep the water circulated. The pump had a massive electrical surge, and a crucial safety device, a ground fault circuit interrupter or GFCI, was not working. A GFCI is designed to shut off the power instantly if it detects a problem like this, and its failure turned the lake into a death trap. The park was later fined by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, for several safety violations. But the horror of that night wasn't over. Just a little over an hour later, around 9:45 p.m., a second tragedy struck on a ride called the Flight Commander. This was a ride where people sat in 2-person pods that would circle a central tower. Riders had a joystick that let them move the pod up and down, or even roll it a full 360 degrees. A 32-year-old woman named Candy Taylor was on the ride. According to the coroner's report, she was heavily intoxicated. She had somehow managed to slip through the ride's restraints and into the empty seat next to her. That empty seat didn't have its restraints in place. When the pod she was in went upside down, she fell 60 feet to her death. Investigators blamed this on a design flaw in the ride's restraint system. After the accident, Kings Island modified the restraints and the dividers between the seats. The ride reopened a year later but was permanently closed and taken down in 1995. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly a day of fun can turn into a nightmare, with dangers lurking where you least expect them. Now we go to a much more recent case, one that was caught on camera in horrifying detail. This is the fireball accident at the Ohio State Fair in 2017. The fireball is a pretty common ride you see at carnivals and fairs. It's a giant pendulum that swings back and forth while the seats at the end of the arm also spin around. It's supposed to be a thrilling, intense experience. But on July 26, 2017, it became a national tragedy. An entire row of seats broke away from the ride, sending riders and debris into the midway below. It all happens in a split second. An 18-year-old high school student named Tyler Jarrell, who had just enlisted in the Marines, was killed. 7 other people were seriously injured, some on the ride and some on the ground who were hit by the flying debris. What made this even more shocking was that the ride had just passed multiple inspections in the days leading up to the fair's opening. The chief ride inspector for the state of Ohio had personally signed off on it, saying it had been looked at 3 or 4 times. So, how could this happen? The investigation went straight to the manufacturer, a Dutch company called KMG. They flew their own investigators to the scene. What they found was terrifying. The cause wasn't a bad weld or a broken part in the traditional sense. It was what they called excessive corrosion on the inside of the main gondola support beam. The ride was 18 years old, and over the years, water had gotten inside the hollow steel support arm and had been slowly eating it away from the inside out. This corrosion had dangerously reduced the thickness of the steel wall of the beam. The manufacturer immediately ordered all 43 fireball rides operating worldwide to be shut down until they could be inspected. They developed a new inspection protocol to prevent something like this from ever happening again. Now we need to go to the United Kingdom for one of the most tragic roller coaster accidents in British history. This is the story of the Big Dipper disaster at Battersea Park in London, all the way back in 1972. The Big Dipper was a classic wooden roller coaster, the main attraction of the fun fair. It was old, first built in 1922, but it was still a huge draw for the city. On May 30th, 1972, during a school holiday, the park was packed with children. What was supposed to be a day of fun turned into an absolute nightmare. The ride started like any other. The train, made of 3 cars, was being pulled up the main lift hill by a steel cable. It was almost at the very top when the cable snapped. The anti-rollback device, which is supposed to click into the track and prevent the train from rolling backward, also failed. The train full of riders began to roll backward down the steep hill, picking up speed. People in the queue below reportedly laughed at first, thinking it might be some kind of trick or part of the ride, but it wasn't. The brakeman at the back of the train frantically tried to apply the manual brake, but it was completely useless. The train, now moving at a high speed in reverse, hit a sharp turn at the bottom of the hill. The force was too much. The last car of the train derailed and was ripped from the other 2 cars, crashing through a wooden barrier. The remaining 2 cars continued rolling until they smashed into another train that was waiting in the station. A survivor, who was 14 at the time, described everything going into slow motion as they shot backward. She saw the brakeman desperately trying to stop them, and then the chaos of the crash, with people groaning and hanging over the edge of the wrecked cars. In the immediate aftermath, children were stranded on the track. One girl screamed that she wanted to get off, and when she leaned on a wooden barrier, it collapsed, and she fell to the ground below. The investigation revealed that just a few days before the crash, a brakeman had complained that the brakes weren't working properly. The ride had also suffered from a history of minor accidents, including another rollback incident and even an arson attack. Safety inspections were minimal, basically just a visual check. Many of the wooden railings were found to be rotten. The railing that collapsed, leading to the girl's fall, was one of them. Despite all this, the park manager and an engineer who were charged with manslaughter were ultimately found not guilty. The court decided that the existing laws and regulations were too weak, and the park had technically followed the inadequate rules. 5 children died in the disaster, and another 13 were injured. The Big Dipper was taken down, and the entire fun fair closed its doors for good just 2 years later. It remains one of the worst theme park accidents in UK history. A tragedy caused by years of neglect and a complete failure of the safety systems that were supposed to protect those kids. This next case happened very recently in 2023, and it's about the Jetline roller coaster at Gröna Lund Park in Stockholm, Sweden. The incident took place on June 25, 2023. Jetline was an older steel coaster, built in 1988 by the now-defunct manufacturer Schwarzkopf, a legendary name among coaster fans. On the day of the accident, a train with 11 riders was sent out. Some experienced riders who had been on it before later said that it felt like it was running a little rougher than usual. As the train came down a curve, a critical part on the front car, a metal piece called a control arm, completely failed. This control arm is what connects the wheel assemblies to the train and holds everything together on the track. When it broke, the front of the first car sagged downwards. The bottom of the train started slamming into the track itself, causing massive, violent jolts. These jolts were so powerful that they displaced several riders, ejecting them from their seats. One woman was killed, and 2 others were seriously injured. The train lost so much speed from scraping along the track that it stalled out and got stuck in the next turn. The Swedish Accident Investigation Authority found the front control arm on the first car had almost completely disintegrated. They found pieces of it on the ground under the track. So why did it break? This is where the story gets complicated. The park had noticed small cracks in these control arms in the past, as far back as 2006. These were usually repaired by certified welders. But in 2019, they decided a control arm was too worn out to repair, and they needed a new one. Since the original manufacturer, Schwarzkopf, was out of business, they had to have a new part custom made. They sent the original blueprints to a contractor. But that contractor didn't actually make the part, they subcontracted the work to another company. And Gröna Lund, the park, was never even told this. The welder at this new company was confused by the 30-year-old blueprints and had questions about how to build it. But because he was a subcontractor of a subcontractor, he had no way to ask the park for clarification. He made his best guess, and he guessed wrong. He left out a crucial internal support piece called a backing bar and used the wrong type of weld. This new improperly made control arm was installed on the accident train in March 2023, just a few months before it failed. The investigation also found that the violent jolts from the failure caused the rider's lap bars to bend forward. The force was so immense that one lap bar bent so far it was essentially open, which is how the rider was ejected. It has forced the entire industry to rethink how they handle maintaining and getting parts for older classic rides. Now we go to Ahmedabad, India, for an accident from 2019 that was also captured on video, and the footage is absolutely gut-wrenching. The ride was called the Discovery, which is a type of pendulum ride. On July 14, 2019, around 30 people were on the ride at an amusement park. The video, which spread rapidly online, shows the ride in mid-swing. It shows the main support giving way, sending the gondola crashing into the structure and then the ground. 2 people, a 24-year-old woman and a 22-year-old man, were killed. Another 27 people were hospitalized with severe injuries, with many listed in critical condition. 6 members of the company that operated the park, Superstar Amusement, were charged with culpable homicide not amounting to murder. This included the managing director, his son, the park manager, and the ride operators. The company's owner initially insisted that all their maintenance and inspections were up to date. He told local media he couldn't understand how it happened, saying the ride had strong, load-bearing cables, and he didn't know how they could have snapped. But fire officials who were first on the scene immediately raised doubts about the ride's maintenance. They pointed out that the broken main arm would need to be closely examined to determine the cause of the failure. The speed with which the authorities filed serious charges suggests they believed this was not just a tragic accident, but the result of serious negligence. This is the haunted castle fire at Six Flags Great Adventure in New Jersey. On May 11, 1984, this walk-through attraction turned into a deadly trap from which 8 teenagers would never escape. The haunted castle was actually made of 17 interconnected truck trailers, arranged to create a confusing maze of dark, narrow corridors. Inside, there were strobe lights, spooky sounds, and live actors who would jump out to scare you. On the evening of the fire, there were about 30 guests making their way through the maze. A fire started, and it spread with terrifying speed. The walls inside the trailers were made of plywood and covered with flammable materials like foam padding and cloth decorations. The smoke was thick and black. When people first saw the smoke and flames, Many thought it was just part of the show, another special effect. This delayed their escape. As people realized the danger was real, panic set in. They were trapped in a maze that was now filled with real smoke and fire, and they couldn't find the way out. Firefighters were on the scene within minutes, but the fire was so intense that the trailers were almost completely destroyed. At first, it was believed that everyone had managed to escape, but then, inside the charred wreckage, 8 teenagers were later discovered inside, initially mistaken for part of the attraction. The investigation found that the fire was started accidentally. A 13-year-old boy who survived testified that he saw another teenager using a cigarette lighter to see his way through a dark part of the maze. The flame got too close to a piece of torn foam padding on the wall, and it instantly went up in flames. But the investigators and the courts did not place the blame on the teenager with the lighter. The real fault lay with Six Flags and the park's management. It was revealed that the haunted castle was a death trap waiting to happen. It had no sprinkler system and no working smoke alarms. Fire safety consultants had recommended them, but because the attraction was considered a temporary structure, they weren't legally required. This was despite the fact that it had been standing in the park for 5 years. In the end, the park and its parent company were cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, but they settled civil lawsuits with the victims' families. The haunted castle is long gone, but the memory of that night serves as a horrific lesson in corporate negligence. Finally, we've reached the bottom of the iceberg. This is the story of Verrückt at the Schlitterbahn water park in Kansas City. Verrückt is the German word for insane, and it was a fitting name. It was certified by Guinness World Records as the world's tallest water slide, standing at a terrifying 168 feet, taller than Niagara Falls. To ride it, you had to climb 264 stairs to the top. From there, you and 2 other riders would board a raft and plunge down the massive drop, hitting speeds of up to 70 miles per hour. After the first drop, you were blasted up a second 50-foot-tall hill before a final plunge into the splash pool. It was this second hill that was at the center of a horrific and fatal design flaw. On August 7, 2016, 10-year-old Caleb Schwab, the son of a Kansas state representative, was on the ride. He was in a raft with 2 adult women. As the raft went over the second hill, it went airborne. Caleb was ejected from the raft and fatally impacted one of the overhead safety structures. The 2 women in the raft with him were also injured. The ride's own co-owner had admitted during its development that their calculations were based on roller coasters, not water slides, and that early tests had seen rafts with sandbags flying off the slide. They had to delay the opening to make changes, but the ride was still incredibly dangerous. Experts who investigated concluded that the use of simple Velcro straps as restraints was completely inadequate for the speeds and forces involved. The ride should have had rigid over-the-shoulder restraints like a roller coaster. Furthermore, the metal poles and netting system, which were put in place to keep rafts from flying off the slide, created their own deadly hazard. This accident led to criminal charges, including second-degree murder, against the ride's designer and the park's co-owner, though these charges were later dismissed by a judge. The Verrückt waterslide was torn down in 2018. It was a tragic end to a ride that was designed to push the limits, but ultimately went too far.